Well, on the import side, companies that previously depended solely on China for their inputs have almost universally adopted a China plus one other country policy, which addresses the import and supply blockage problem. On the export side, though, which is as big or even bigger a problem for the country, Australian business in aggregate has reduced its dependency, and therefore the country has reduced its vulnerability to Chinese political whims considerably. When the first trade bans went on 4 years ago, Australia was dependent on China for 40% of its exports, which, as exposure to one country, is obviously just ridiculously imprudent. And so it proved. We hadn't seen that level of overdependence on one country since the 60s and 70s, when Australia was relying on Mother Britain. Britain, of course, joined the common market, slammed the door in Australia's face, and Australia got a big shock. We failed to learn that lesson. We've just had it administered to us again, this time by the People's Republic of China. The net result is that 40% dependency is now 25. So it's a 15 percentage point drop in Australia's export exposure to China. However, 25 is still by far the biggest exposure to any one country, is still a very large vulnerability. And as you see from the companies flocking to sign deals and to ingratiate themselves with the Chinese Premier today, many of them seem as keen as ever and maybe haven't fully absorbed the lesson that your customer is a dictatorship which changes trade policy on a whim and cannot be relied upon.
And, to that point too, it is also a country that wants to get its economic ambitions and on their terms. We saw the Chinese Premier in WA today. We know that the door has been closed on them getting Chinese ownership in some of our rare earth minerals companies. But have they necessarily given up? Is that not their end game, and will they keep pushing until they achieve that?
Yes, it's a state-directed policy. It's not Chinese companies acting autonomously and independently. This comes from Xi Jinping, the president, to get a stranglehold on all the vital inputs for the industries of the future. In all of those cases, Australia is prepared to allow some degree of Chinese investment. The critical point is that it not be allowed to control the output. The whole point of Australia's policy on renewable energy and critical minerals now is to make sure that Australia does not put itself in that position where it exports the raw commodities to China, China processes them, and then decides who gets them, when, and on what terms. So Australia's federal government has been much more prudent in how it allows foreign investment and control, but it is allowing investment, and one of the facilities that they toured today was a jointly financed Chinese-Australian lithium mine. So that was to showcase the fact that the two countries can do business together, can invest together, but the federal government is just being a lot more prudent in refusing to allow China to keep and develop a stranglehold on those rare earths, because at the moment it has something like 90% control of processed rare earths. Australia wants to get that down, and with the help of federal government investment here and US and other countries' investment in the private sector, that is the policy.
Yeah. As both sides talk about rejuvenation and almost stabilisation, the example of Cheng Lei was really indicative of how the mask might have changed. They might have put on their happy face for us now, but they still want to control the narrative.
Yes, but the mask came off 4 years ago, and we saw the real face of the Chinese Communist Party's intentions, which was to break Australia's sovereign will, and served up not only the political ban, the $20 billion worth of trade sanctions, but also the list of 14 demands that Australia changed policy to suit China. We can't forget that, even though they've put the smiling face back on. We're not going to forget what we saw underlying the mask, and 70% or so of Australians in two recent opinion polls have said they think China is a future security risk or military risk to Australia. So the public won't allow the politicians to forget. And it's true, the mask slipped just briefly yesterday. And as you say, we saw censorship practiced by Chinese diplomats in the Australian Parliament, in front of the Australian Prime Minister, his cabinet ministers, and the entire Australian national media. This shows, obviously, disrespect at the very least, but I thought it also showed the fragility and sensitivity of the regime. It can't, it needs to censor, needs to protect itself from the least even hint of criticism. That's not a confident regime. That's a regime that is anxious about its legitimacy and can't cop criticism. And it will continue to intrude as far as we allow it to into our systems, our values, our laws and our policies, and ride roughshod over them wherever it suits the Chinese Communist Party to do so, and wherever the Australian government is gullible enough to allow it.
Yeah, and the Australian government is at pains to tell us that they are raising issues, sensitive issues, with the Chinese government. But then we see this kind of intimidation of Australian citizens, dual nationals potentially, on Australian soil happening in this very insidious way. How important is it, do you think, that Australia is conscious of it and clamps down on it?
Well, the Australian Parliament passed laws against foreign interference 7 years ago now, Bev. And it's clear from the evidence we've seen in the last few days that it's not being properly enforced. Those laws are being ignored. The story that my colleague Matthew Knott broke in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age on Saturday disclosed that two prominent Australian citizens, Drew Pavlou and Vicky Xu, had been told 10 months ago by the Australian Federal Police that they were the subject of a Chinese interference operation. They were both advised to change their personal habits to minimise the risk to their personal safety. And in the 10 months since, they've heard nothing further from the Australian Federal Police. And in Drew Pavlou's words, he is gobsmacked that there have been no arrests or prosecutions made. So what that tells us, Bev, is that Chinese agents of influence, Chinese Communist Party agents of influence, are covertly intimidating Australian citizens in Australia today, and the authorities know and are watching on and are not acting, certainly in those cases. And if they're prepared to do that in the case of two prominent Australians who have profile, access to resources and all the rest, we can only imagine what they're doing to the vulnerable members of the Australian Chinese community who are their prime target. They want to bully, manipulate, intimidate and control. So this is a really troubling sign, Bev, that the federal government is lacking the political will, because that's all it takes. The laws are in place, the agencies are there, the federal police exist, ASIO exists, to actually enforce those laws. And we just have to hope and expect that they'll get around to it in a hurry.
Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Good to talk, Pete. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Bev.